Welcome to Old Path Ministries and our study through the book of 2 Corinthians. We're going to take a lot of the text here in this one. We're going to look at chapters 8 and 9 and combine them together. And the reason for that simply is because we have in this details of a collection that was being taken up in some of the churches that were in this area. So Macedonia is mentioned, and then also down in here to Corinth. You can take a look at Romans 15:26 is one of the places that you'll see it mentioned. This collection is mentioned. And also chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians, when we were in that book ends talking about this. So let me just very quickly discuss what the collection was all about. There's not a lot of detail that we get as far as the condition of things in Jerusalem, but we get this understanding that there are some desperate times, if you will, for the church there at Jerusalem. So the long and the short of it is this. Paul made it a part of the ministry that he had among those churches in his second missionary journey that they would take up a collection. And the churches there in that part of the world some of them had more than others, but they were going to take up a collection and give it to the church there for the needs of the saints in Jerusalem. So clearly, by the time that all of this is going on, difficulty had fallen there at Jerusalem. The interesting thing about it, and again, we don't understand all the dynamics of how it worked. We know that by reading chapter 8 of the book of Acts, that all of the persecution was so intense that really all that was left was the apostles. Everybody else had been kind of driven out. So what was there remaining of the church by the time that Paul comes back from his second missionary journey? That's kind of the question, because he winds up in Jerusalem eventually, but the collection makes its way to Jerusalem. So with the little bits and pieces that we can get together of this, we do know this. The churches in that part of the world, though they had their difficulties and everything else, financially it wasn't really as big of a problem for them as it seems to have been there in Jerusalem. So Paul and a host of other people that are mentioned more in chapter 8, some of them, two of the three, are mentioned without naming them. So we're not sure exactly who they are. But Titus is mentioned by name, and so there are people that are helping this whole process of collecting, keeps it out of Paul's hands directly. And so Paul can't be blamed for taking money from the churches, not knowing where it goes. There were other people that were trustworthy, and a number of them, so it was able to be overseen. So chapter 8 is really kind of, as we might read it, kind of laborious in the amount of detail that's given, and something apparently from, again, we piece this all together. From what was happening in chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians, by the time that Paul writes and says these things in chapters 8 and 9, you can see that he's wanting to make sure that they fulfilled the obligation that they had given. And then also chapter 9 deals with the mentality of giving to support people and support ministry. So we're going to get to that because there's so much confusion about tithing nowadays. So I thought it would be a good time to pick that up in chapter 9. So we're going to kind of work through chapter 8 pretty quickly. It is, again, it's really, really wordy, but again, it is Paul just talking about his thankfulness that they're willing to do this, and also the accountability that comes along with it, where he wants them to realize that the people who are helping the collection and making sure that it gets to where it's supposed to go are trustworthy. And so, again, accountability comes into this. It's an important part, especially when you see the nonsense that's happening in ministries nowadays, and especially those types of ministries that make no apologies for all of the lavish things that they do. And the carrot that they dangle in front of people is, if you give us a bunch of money, then God's going to somehow be obligated to give you something in return. Just know this, that this is not the kind of a chapter that they'd want to use here for that mentality, because remember, the collection that's being taken by these churches is being given to another church. It's not giving to Paul's ministry. It's not giving to the ministry of the people who are collecting it. This is for people that are in desperate need, and it's going to another location entirely, kind of where it all started. It's going back to Jerusalem. So Interesting how that, again, people manipulate the scriptures because of personal gain. So chapter 8 is where we'll pick up. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you as we gather together to study your word. We pray, Father, that you would help us to learn what is necessary here, and the idea of support and all of that. We get the history aspect of it, but there is something for us to learn in this as well, and that by the idea of giving is something that is made very personal for the individual, and that there is so much corruption in the church about this topic. Lord, may we understand what your heart is in this matter, and Paul helps us with that. So we pray, God, that you would help us to be attentive. So we give you thanks, we give you all praise, and ask that you'd bless this study, and by the work of your Spirit, God, you'd make these things known to us in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so chapter 8, verse 1 starts over, "Moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches at Macedonia." So Macedonia, from where Corinth is down at the bottom of modern-day Greece, okay? So Paul has already come up there. He's been to Athens. He's moved over to Corinth. But Macedonia is up over here. So that's where Philippi would be, and Berea, Thessalonica, those places where he first came in his second missionary journey. So it says this, that in great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. So those churches would not be quite what you would have in the places like Corinth and Athens, because those are, not only are they huge cities, but they are very, very heavy commercial. As far as up there further in Macedonia, not so much. So there's this dynamic between the poverty in the very real sense, but their willingness to, even out of their poverty, to give something to the people who are in Jerusalem that they would view as even worse shape than they are. So here Paul is making sure that the church there at Corinth is making good on its obligation, but reminding them that there are churches who have far less, but are very much willing to support the church in Jerusalem because it's in the worst of the shape of the churches. So he says in verse 3, "For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and even beyond their ability, they were freely willing," about the giving of what they did. So they went above and beyond, "imploring us with much urgency that they would receive the gift, that we would rather receive the gift of and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints." Now those saints are the ones that are being spoken of in Jerusalem. So again, you can read those other places. There's a lot of bits and pieces that you can take from a few of the other epistles. And so this was a secondary thing. Of course, Paul's primary mission was to preach the gospel and to make sure that churches were sound. He was, of course, giving correction and teaching. He was doing all of that. But at the same time, the message was, when we go back to Jerusalem, we would like to have something that we could take to help them in their distress. So he says, verse 4, "imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints, and not only as we had hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and then to us by the will of God. And so we urged Titus that he would that as he had begun, so he would also complete this grace in you as well." So Paul is also mentioning to them as well that there's not just Paul, but Titus is involved in this as well. Now, Titus, we've already been able to hear about him in chapter 7 in particular, but this was a person that was involved there at Corinth as well, as kind of working between Paul and the church there at Corinth. But it was not just about this collection. That was just a secondary issue. He was there to check on the spiritual well-being about them and how the church was doing at Corinth, and he had given that report to Paul. And really, it was kind of the genesis for this whole epistle of chapter 2, or the second chapter. The second book to the Corinthians. So in Titus's time there were a number of things that he was going to be accomplishing. So the idea also that he would be involved in the collecting of this. Titus had a lot that he was involved with Paul and the church there at Corinth. You could just kind of see the going back and forth of this. But what Paul's doing, again, is really making sure that he builds this case of a few things that are going on. First and foremost, as they know, is the need, at least in this part of it. Now, Paul deals with a lot of doctrinal things in other parts of the book too, but for the focus of this, chapters 7, 8, and 9, it is the collection for the church at Jerusalem. So here's the big things that we know. Paul is wanting to make sure that they understand the plight of what's happening in Jerusalem, that there is an involvement among the Gentile churches to help to eliminate the suffering of what's happening or whatever was the need there at Jerusalem, and then at the same time to realize that they are all to be invested in this, especially since they said that they were willing to help, and the 1 Corinthians book helps us with that understanding. So in verse 7, but as you abound in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in diligence, and in your love for us, see that you also abound in this grace also. Make sure that you're supporting those people as well. He commends them, and some would say he's probably trying to, butter them up, I guess is one of the words that we would use. I don't see him doing that. I think he understands how disingenuous that would be. But at the same time, it is to keep them accountable and then to say, well, here's what I do remember these things, or I do pay attention to these things in you as well. Verse 8, he says, I speak not by the commandment, but I am testing the sincerity of your love by the diligence of others. For you know that the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, through that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that you through his poverty might become rich. Of course, he's speaking in the spiritual sense here. So it is the overall picture of this is the supplying the need. So the needy is helped by the person who has the means. In this case, it was the spiritual aspect of it, clearly. There was this thing that you people had, which was great poverty in the way of spirit, and Jesus was rich in those things, so he could give you those things that you could not provide for yourself. So there's a spiritual aspect to this, of course, that helps them to understand the very literal here and now kind of consequence as well. So in verse 10, and in this I give advice. It is to your advantage not only to be doing what you had begun and were desiring to do a year ago, 1 Corinthians chapter 16, but now you also must complete the doing of it, that there is a readiness and a desire to it, so there also may be a completion out of what you have. For if there is first a willing mind, it is accepted according to what one has and not according to what one does not have. So this again, you had made this pledge, you have the ability to do it now. It's important that you follow through with this. So again, it's not a hard sell kind of a thing, but there's a bigger part of this as well, that if you're going to make a commitment to something, the worst thing that you can have is a believer who says, I say that I will do this, but then they don't. And it's bad enough that a person's word can't be changed or trusted rather, but when they change that, the people that are going to hurt the worst, it's not Paul, it's the church there at Jerusalem that is in real desperate need. So again, he appeals to them in a way of just saying, this is the right, it's the honorable thing to do. Fulfill the obligation that you had made. The need is real. And this is something that you have in abundance. It's something that you can provide for. And so it's important that you follow through with these things. Verse 13, for I do not mean that others should be eased and that you be burdened. So it's all of the churches are doing this. But by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may supply their lack, and their abundance may also supply your lack, that there may be equality. So the point is, who knows, the day may come when you're in this situation and the roles are reversed, and the Jerusalem church would be the ones that would want to minister to you. And remember this too, Paul doesn't make this case, though he could. He does kind of in other places, but he didn't have to come to them. But he came to them because he was compelled to do so, because of the call that God had put upon his life. But it wasn't an easy thing for him to leave from where he was and to come all the way to that part of the world. He didn't plan to do it. If you remember in his second missionary journey, when he first came to Corinth, he had started in Macedonia and all those places, but that was not his original plan. He was coming this way and just going to be in Asia Minor, heading towards the area where the 7 churches are. But he wound up going across because God showed him that. And he went all the way through Macedonia and then down to Athens and then ultimately to Corinth here. So Paul could easily make the case of, look, I didn't get paid to come here. I didn't come this way from where I was to where I am for any obligation other than God had driven me here, not knowing what I would find, but now look at what God has done through you, this church here in Corinth, and in this part of the world. I mean, it evangelized that whole part of the world. So Paul could play that card if he wanted to, doesn't need to. He's just saying, you've made a commitment, now hold to your commitment. So, verse 16, but thanks be to God who puts the same earnest care for you in the heart of Titus. So once again, Titus is going to become an issue here. And not only, for he not only accepted the exhortation, but being more diligent, he went to you of his own accord. So he didn't go out of compulsion, just like Paul never did. He went because he felt compelled to do these things. Now again, he wasn't there just with his hand out. He was there ministering to them on a number of other things too. While there, let them know of the need. They pledged to help. Great. So he's going to take whatever it is that they pledged to do and make sure that it gets where it's supposed to go. So we have sent with him a brother. We don't know who it is. Now again, there's a lot of speculation. Who's this other brother? And it ranges from everything from Apollos to Barnabas to Silas to Mark is one of the people that's mentioned, and it could be other ones as well. But we're not given the details, doesn't matter. They would have been with Titus, so the people reading this know exactly who these people are. But this is Paul's way of saying, I sent men to you. These men are trustworthy, and it's not Paul asking for it, so Paul can't be the center of attention in this. It'll never be about Paul, if you will. So he says, and we have sent, verse 18, with him a brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout all of the churches. Some even say it may have been Luke. But it's not the gospel as in the written word. It's the gospel. It's the ministry that whoever this unnamed person is, he's a person who is dedicated to the furthering and the ministering of the gospel. So they would know who he is. They would know that this is a trustworthy man. So, verse 19, and not only that, but who has also chosen by the churches to travel with us with this gift. So again, not just Paul, but the churches were involved in this. And if we remember early on, back in the book of Acts, it was really the church at Jerusalem that had mentioned it, and they commissioned Paul to go and do these things. So the churches had sent. It's not just Paul's the one-man, kind of collection agency and sends a few of his people. There's a whole movement behind this. And Paul wants to make sure that that is written and put down in record to say, just in case. Now, here's a couple of things about it that we don't know for sure. Was there somebody causing a rift in this, saying, Paul doesn't really care about the church in Jerusalem, he's just looking to get money out of you? Well, Paul takes that completely out of the realm of possibility by giving this information. I'm not collecting it. Titus is there with other people, and it's the churches that have sent those people to go and do these things. So Paul is independent of it. So if anybody wants to try to accuse Paul of something, Paul's hands are out of it. This is really, think about this. What a juxtaposition as we have in this world today. Because seemingly the guys that are begging the most for money are the guys that are telling you that they need to have your money for their ministry or else God's not going to give you stuff. Paul is the total antithesis to the money-grubbing guys that you see on television all the time that are saying, if you'll, tithe to my ministry, God will, sow your seed of faith, all that garbage that we hear all the time. And basically they're selling all their, CDs and books and all that stuff at just exorbitant rates. And it's really of no use because it's pretty much a money-making kind of a scheme for them. So the scriptural value of whatever it is that you're going to be purchasing is going to be obviously pretty awful because their doctrine is so messed up. But compare what Paul does here, because it's totally different. Paul's not saying, tithe to my ministry. Paul was actually a guy who worked with his hands. So here he is saying the churches have sent these people out. They're collecting this. They're going to take it back to the people with need. I have my hands washed of it. I don't need any of this. This is not for me to be involved with. Again, what a difference, huh? So, verse 20, avoiding this, that anyone should blame us in this lavish gift, which is administered by us, providing honorable things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. So I'm just as a part of this, I will be a part of them that goes, but we're giving this gift. We're separate from it. It's not for us, it's for someone else. In verse 22, and we have sent with them our brother, another person that's mentioned here, whom we have often proved, who has often proved diligent in many things, but now much more diligent because of the great confidence which we have in you. So they know who he is, and we know that when you see these people, we can have confidence that you will do those things, not worried about where it's going next, because you know the people are going to take it. So this matter of trust is hugely, hugely important, and it is central to this whole part of the book. Verse 23, we'll finish out this chapter, and then Paul starts to get into a little bit more of, I guess you could say, kind of the motivation of why we do the things that we do. Verse 23, now if anyone inquires about Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker concerning you. Or if our brethren are inquired about, they are messengers of the churches, the glory of Christ. That's those other unnamed people and whoever else may be with them. But this is once again Paul giving, if you will, kind of a defensive, I guess you could say, of the whole thing of ministry that goes on there. Whether it's the collection or whether it's anything that they do in ministry, the churches have combined together, and these are people that the churches have sent out. Paul's not just some free agent, and the people with him are not just working for him. This is a work that the Lord has given and commissioned. And, again, if you go all the way back to 2 Corinthians, when we get to chapter 3, that's where he just talks about you're the living epistles. You're the evidence of our ministry. Verse 24, therefore, show to them and before the churches the proof of your love and of your boasting on your behalf. So make good on your commitments. And in whether it's the gift itself or if it's how you interact with the people that are there in the church, let there be a consistency with what we say about you, what people say about you. Let's make sure that there is always a consistency to these things. Now, Paul's going to turn his attention of the ministering to the saints. He is going to be looking at what we would call tithing, or it's really a bad word that we use in the church because it's not a tithe, but the idea of giving. He really turns his focus back to, not only with as far as, well, I'll back up a little bit. As far as chapter 8 is concerned, his concern is more the integrity of the collection that they're doing and of the ministry as a whole. Reminds them of who the people are who are doing this ministry, the two men that are unnamed and Titus, plus whoever else may be there. There is never a disconnect between the people who have been there and the things that they have said that they would do and what was actually done. And again, they don't come to town expecting to take stuff away for themselves. This is the one instance where they're asking for help for people other than themselves, and they'll make sure that they take it back to them. So in chapter 9, he gets back to the idea of support. And that's where, sometimes if you're going to find a place that the Bible talks about giving and support, this is really the best place for it. So let me stop real quick and mention what tithing is. We hear people talk about tithing, which is an Old Testament principle. It means a 10th part. So whatever it was that a person would have been, again, that was among the children of Israel. So among the children of Israel, if it was livestock, if it was grain, if it was oil, if it was wine, whatever it was that they produced, the first of it, the 10th part, the first part of the best of it was given, and it was given then to the priesthood. It was an offering to the Lord, but remember, it would be to sustain the ministry to the people that were there, because the priests didn't have the ability to do these things for themselves. They were given to the service of the Lord on behalf of the people. So this was a way of the people having a two-pronged obligation. They were to make sure that the needs of the priests and of the temple and of the worship was seen to. And at the same time, it was for them to say, we are going to give of what God has first given to us, and we will give back to him as a way of offering and honoring him. Of course, it was a mess. It was a real messed up situation, because man's heart is just kind of weird that way. But that's the children of Israel. That's the 10th part. That's the tithe. So what is there as far as the church today is concerned? We'll still hear churches all the time about tithing your 10% and your tithe and this, that, and the other thing. It's all nonsense. it's not biblical. So as far as a tenth part, there's no such thing as a tenth part to the church. Paul here probably gives us the most clear direction of what it should be. And so and he really kind of touched on it in the last chapter. It's based upon means. What is there that you have? So, verse 1 of chapter 9. Now concerning the ministering to the saints, it is superfluous for me to write to you. For I know your willingness, about which I boast of you to the Macedonians and Achaia, was already a year ago, and your zeal has stirred up the majority. So this goes back again to what was said in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. So yeah, word gets around. There's a need. And it wasn't intended to be a competition, but at the same time, think about it this way. If you had a bunch of churches and they're trying to collect something for needs, yeah, there does become a bit of a competition, or so it could be. And so this may be to what he's referring. For verse 3, yet I have sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this respect, that as I said, that you may be ready, lest if some Macedonians come with me, and they find you unprepared, we, not to mention you, should be ashamed of this confident boasting. So yeah, Paul wants them to be accountable. Look, you guys made a promise that you would do this. Now there would be people traveling with them, and the last thing that the Corinthians would want to be seen, because it's a part of the world. Commercially, it's a port. That's the southern tip of Greece. So them and Athens, Athens is kind of like right next door to you. And so Athens, Greece, this is a very, very wealthy area. It's got a lot of commerce. It's got a lot of trade. It's ports. It's, the sea is right there. So Paul's way of saying, by the time that we get there, and by the time that people come down and the Macedonians are with us, that's a part of the world that's not quite like you. It doesn't have quite what you have, but they're prepared and they're going to be there. And if they come to you and find out that you've done nothing about this, think about how that looks. We've said of you that you're prepared, and what would happen if we got there and you're not? So this goes ahead of him, of course. So, therefore, verse 5, I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren to go to you ahead of time, prepare your generous gift beforehand, which you have previously promised, 1 Corinthians 16, that it may be ready as a matter of generosity and not of grudging obligation. Now, finally, we can get to the point of this, where we can get past what is the historical aspect of this. We can get past the Macedonians were going to do this, the Grecians were going to do this, and there's the competition that's going on, and there's maybe the question about the integrity of it. So Titus and all this, this is just so much minutia that to us means really much of nothing aside from this. There should be accountability. Absolutely should be accountability. The idea if a person makes a pledge, in this case, we the church at Corinth, we are going to help the cause there at Jerusalem. Okay, great. Make good on what you're... I hate to use the word pledge because sometimes churches will do pledge drives. I hate it. They'll put the thermometer thing up on the wall. We need X number for our sanctuary or this, that, or the other thing. And they got a thermometer. And then, through the years, kind of like every time you look at it, they're like browbeating you into giving money. So you see the pledges every time that those ministries have their people on the phone and people are calling in their pledges, and just the marketing of the church and the merchandising of the people of God is disgusting. So what Paul has done to this point, Paul has made sure that they understand there is an obligation that you guys have made. And the last thing that you want to do is lose face. You've said this, so follow through on it. Now, here's where Paul gets to the heart and why we would be supporting as we do. This is the part that is important. He says this in verse 6, but this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. He who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Now, here's this thing that we'll a lot of times hear from the preachers on television. They'll use this passage right here. But as I've said earlier, let's remember, Paul is not going to reap any benefit from this at all. So this is not for Paul's ministry. This is for the people in Jerusalem. His point is, if you guys have said you were going to do such a thing, make sure that your word matches your deed. So if you're going to say that you're going to do such a thing, but you hold back a bunch of things, just realize that God will not honor what you're doing because you've said you would do one thing, but yet you do another. that would be a problem. And again, Paul benefits from this? Not at all. The people that benefit for it, the people back in Jerusalem. That's where the need is. So this collection is a need for someone else. It's not for Paul. So to try to have some preacher tell us today that, if you don't sow to my ministry, then you're not understanding the whole principle of tithe. And if you do so sparingly, then God's not going to give you a whole lot in return, kind of a thing. They just try to hard sell people on this. There's a truthfulness in what Paul says here, though. There has to be the understanding that if people have the wherewithal, especially when a need like this arises, that they ought to take that into consideration. That's all that Paul is trying to make here. It's not for some way to drive up big funding. Verse 7. So, here he says, let each one give as he purposes in his heart. So if somebody says you're obligated to 10%, right there says absolutely different. If anyone ever tells you that you have to give 10%, say, that's the Old Testament, that is under the law. What do we offer as far as the church is concerned? It's found right here. Let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or out of necessity, for God loves the cheerful giver. That's the important part of it. What if a person has enormous sums of money, more money than they'll ever know what to do with? And if they give more than 10%, fine. That's what they've purposed in their heart. And that's between them and the Lord. And that's the most important part of all of this. Whatever anybody does, it's no one else's business. In the Old Testament sense of tithing, it was everybody else's business, if you will, because everyone was obligated to the same share. Here's a different story. Now, again, the context of this is the collection that is going to the people there at Jerusalem. And it would probably go to the needs of the house church. Because think about this. Where they are in that part of the world, the idea of Christians in the midst of a pagan culture, the pagan culture is not going to take care of them. Governments didn't take care of the people. The churches were going to have to take care of themselves. So yeah, there is a need, and this is why even ourselves, we've moved here to Texas, my wife and I. Does that mean that we don't, since I'm doing all of this ministry online, does that mean that we don't tithe anywhere? No, we attend a church here now that we're in Texas, and we support that ministry. Why? Because that's where God's ministering to us when we sit in the congregation. They pay the bills. They pay the lights. They pay the rent on the place. They buy the equipment. They do all of that kind of stuff. So we, out of what we have, are able to support that ministry. It is really just that simple. Now, if somebody would say, but you don't like the church that you're at, or you don't know that you trust them or anything else, the first question you have to ask is, well, why are you there in the first place? But more importantly than that, find a place that you trust and then realize that your giving is not to the church or to the ministry. Your church, your ministry or your giving is to the Lord first and foremost, and He has provided for you that particular ministry. And as long as they're credible and do the things that they're supposed to do, and there's oversight and there is integrity to it, like we read in the last chapter here, great, support it, because the Lord's using that to minister. That's all that there is to it. So as a person does, make sure it's not out of grudging. And if you do so, I mean, it's like we've seen all the movies, like you just don't want to give it, you're like holding onto it really super tight. That's a heart problem. So God would say, get that fixed. That's the big problem. Fix the problem with your heart before there's anything else. So, verse 8. So God is able to make all grace abound towards you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance of every good work. Now, I have used this passage when I will counsel with people that are about to get married, because money and those kind of resources, finances, they're just something that there's a finite amount of. You can't make more than what you earn, unless you're a counterfeiter, and that's a whole new problem. So if you're at the place where God has given you a job and you make X amount of dollars, that's finite. You can't make it stretch further than that. This principle does also fit nicely when it comes to other things that we have in finite amounts, like time, because you only have a certain amount of hours in each day. And there should be that consideration that if you have a certain allotment of time, how much do you give back to the Lord of your time? Not just of your finances. It's not just throwing money in a till or in a box or whatever you put it in. It's also, God's given me a certain amount of time. I want to give my time back to him as well. So if you're in a church and there's a need for things there, find out what they might have need for. Can you give some of your time? Guys doing ushering, or women serving around women's ministry, men and women serving with children's ministry, all the support ministries that go on. There's plenty of things in a church setting that need people for it. So time is also, if you will, kind of a commodity. It's something that there's a finite amount of, and we should be willing to give that back to the Lord as well. So with that being said, verse 9, as it is written, and this is found in Psalm 112, verse 9, he has dispersed abroad and he has given to the poor. His righteousness endures forever. So really the ultimate recognition is that it's really God who has given us the reason why we would understand that we should give back to him in the first place. Paul brings it back to where it's supposed to be. Now, may he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food supply and multiply the seed that you have sown and increase the fruits of your righteousness. And so, there is that idea. Let it be. There's nothing wrong with being or saying something like this. Hey, let me just paraphrase Paul saying, and God provides for the needs of all of these things. And I pray that he sees in your generosity and he rewards you for your generosity. But it's a wishful, hopeful kind of a thing. It would work as far as that's how God is seeing those kinds of things. So if we're going to give out of what we have, should we be able to expect that God will supply what our needs are as well? Yeah, he should. If there's grudging and all the rest of it, it's like, okay, I'll do it because I'm obligated to do it. Well, don't expect that God's going to look at that and say, that's done in the right heart. You may find yourself in some difficult times with that because God's being mocked at that point. So at verse 11, while you are enriched in everything for all liberality, which causes thanksgiving through us to God. For the administration of this service not only supplies the needs of the saints, but also is abounding through many thanksgiving to God. So again, if you're doing all these things that you've committed to do, and we are able to take it there, there's not just the blessing that it is for the people that will get it that are in all kinds of difficult times. Paul rejoices in it because the church at Corinth is directly affecting and helping the people in Jerusalem, and it's a fruit of his ministry. He's able to see the needs taken care of by some on behalf of another, and it's a fruit of the ministry that God sent him to Corinth for in the first place. So you get Paul looking at this. Think of the blessing that goes all the way around. Some of it has nothing to do with material. It's all of spiritual nature. While through the proof of this ministry, they glorify God for the obedience of your confession to the gospel of Christ and for your liberal sharing with them and for all men. So imagine the time when they finally show up there, when it all happens, and they see the mounds of this, or the large sum of money that is brought, and it brings instant relief to the people. Imagine if you're them. They're in such dire condition, and all of a sudden people show up and these needs are being met. And think about how that would look and how that reflects on the people here at Corinth. And by their prayer for you, who long for you because of the exceeding grace of God in you, thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. Bringing it back once again to the spiritual of things. Because the material things are only for a time, and they'll come and go. A person may have financial problems for some time, but they may be restored not too far down the road. And there's that kind of up and down that happens with it. But to the believer, if we genuinely are in that place of fellowship with him, there's never a poverty of spiritual matters. No matter what we have in the material sense, spiritually, that never changes. So the importance of remembering that. Again, this closes out kind of this section, and I'm kind of glad it does, because it's just so much internal history between Paul and the church at Corinth and what was happening there at Jerusalem. There are some things we can glean from it, again, about the idea of giving and supporting of ministries. The places where we go to Sundays, hopefully during the weeks, I'm hoping that you get a chance to get to your churches and to be around the fellowship with the brothers and sisters. But if that's the case, just remember, buildings have expenses, and that never changes. It's an ongoing thing. And if it's a big enough ministry, the people who see to the ministry are probably going to be on staff full time. And I can tell you this too. I do know from my own personal experience and the other people that I know, they are probably capable of earning more in the private sector than they do working for the church. So they do what they do. It still helps to sustain them, but it's by no means lavish if it's being done correctly. A person will probably live on what he can on the pastoral side of things, but the idea that they live some lavish lifestyle, yeah, that probably means that some things are a bit out of balance. But again, remember, there are so many people that they're so frustrated by the opulence that they see on display with many pastors and many churches that they might think that goes on in their own. Once again, find out what goes on in your church. Find out what things are, what tithe goes to. And take a look what the guy drives, probably be a good indication. But those types of things are important for us to understand. What do they do, and what's happening in the ministry? Are the needs being met as they should proportionately? Are you getting a hard sell over the pulpit? Are they always talking about money and giving and all the rest of that? That's out of balance. In fact, you wouldn't hear any of this if we didn't get to chapters 7, 8, and 9 in 2 Corinthians. I hate talking about this kind of stuff. It's just in the text, so we'll stick with it and we'll make sure that we understand what it is. But again, of all things, if people start to lay some trip on you about tithing, they are totally unbiblical in their take on this, and they should be ignored. When we see the guys actually with their hands out in ministry who live great lifestyles with their jets and their houses and all that stuff, when they're begging you for money, run the other way. I hope that they all go bankrupt and that God can maybe get their attention on the right things. So with all that said, interesting stuff. If you have any questions on that, feel free to contact me by email. Love to be able to discuss it further with you. If you've got one of those situations where you're at a church and you're wondering about that and you want to ask some other questions, I'll be happy to do it. I don't have a church, so I'm not asking you to support our ministry. God takes care of us through the ministry. It's kind of an amazing thing, but I won't ask for things. This is unfortunately just the world in which we live. I know it's a big thing out here in Texas now, all of the prosperity gospel and all the rest of it. But if it's something that you're struggling with and you have any further details you'd like to discuss with us, again, you can contact me through the website, through the email that's there, and we'll move along starting to chapter 10 next week, and we'll get back into some more of the doctrinal kind of things and get past this part with just all the history and the defensiveness about some things. So next week we'll pick it up there, chapter 10, and I'll see you next week. God bless you as you pursue him in your word, or in his word.